we're very glad for having you. It's for our seminar, I think it's a breaking point, let's say, a very important moment. And we'd like to continue with that if George Kandilis and Pavlos Baltas allow me to speak on behalf of them, on behalf of the two organizers who have done fantastic job so far. We also enrolled Nicolas Stasinopoulos, our good colleague, and we have also him with us tonight in order to make a presentation of our invited speaker and also give some ideas, insights that maybe will be useful at the discussion later, and also to introduce us the work of Todd McGowan. So thank you very much, Todd, for being here. And I give the floor to Nikos for giving more details about our invited speaker. Thank you.
Honored to have you, Todd McGowan, with us, the well-established film theorist and Lacanian scholar. And check the chat for what he has written on film theory and Lacanian theory. A century ago, Freud visited the US to lecture at Clark University, and while approaching the New York port, it's a fair say that said to Jung, they don't realize that we're bringing them the plague. Having in mind that thought means death in German, I had the association that now we're bringing the plague back to Europe. Okay, it's not the case, but I'm touching base here for just a couple of hints on Lacanian epistemology that Todd deploys. Our first station is, as mentioned before, ideology in truth, in the Lacanian Todd McGowan's theory. Firstly, we have a late modern update of the outmodish, outdated ideology definition as a false consciousness, that the subjects will change just gaining some knowledge. The new formula is they know very well what they are doing, but they carry on doing it. Lacanians suggest a crucial adjustment of that. They know what they're doing, but in their activity, in their doing, not in their thinking. There's also the Althuserian definition of ideology, currently out of circulation. For Althusser, you get caught in ideology when you fully recognize yourself in its interpellation, when you subjectivize its demands and become one with them. While for Lacanians, the only spot they really encounter you is in the spot when you are dumping yourself, where you are a problem for yourself. That's St. Augustine. The subject, which is not the privatizing subject in neoliberal individualism, is the solution and not the problem. For Althusser, ideology is the imaginary relationship of the subjects with their real conditions of existence. The researcher of ideology addresses our imaginary relations to them. For Lacanians, on the other hand, ideology is not an escape for reality, but reality itself is a way of escaping a social traumatic kernel, the real. The real is a specific spot in social reality when social reality is inconsistent by a fundamental internal antagonism. Ideology turns internal systemic contradictions to external oppositions of, let's say, eternal enemies. On top of the above, for Todd McGowan, ideology is a narrative that justifies and legitimizes our own lack as subjects. It makes us believe that our lack has a reason. Ideology makes us put the blame on someone or something that make us burdened and feel unfulfilled and not complete.
Πολύ άβολο το επισκεπτήριο 2,5-3,5, λέει το Ελλάδη θα κανονίσει έτσι. Ή Αφροδίτη τώρα με την δεν έχει φάει τίποτα.
Συγγνώμη το μικρόφωνο σου.
Κάποιος έχει παρέμβει.
It uses fantasy to do that. Not every use of fantasy is ideological, but ideology needs fantasy for support and lets subjects be engaged and feel free using it. In capitalism, you need the lot of fantasy. That is your chance now, so you can let yourself responsibly gamble. Τζογάρετε υπεύθυνο. Let's now delve a little further into some more perceptions of Todd's Lacanianism. Lacanians are Freudians. in the sense that they stress, along with Freud of group psychology and the analysis of ego, that the division between the individual and the group falls within the individual subject itself. The subject is a joint entity, psychic and social at once. Psychoanalysis, like Hegelians or Marxian, let's say, is a kind of conflictual science because it's situated within the conflict that it theorizes. The criterion of scientific objectivity is not a supposed neutrality, the perpetuation of the given conditions of antagonism, just because it strikes us as self-evident. The criterion of objectivity in Lacanians is rather the capacity of theory to validly occupy a singular point of view within the situation. Objectivity is the capacity of being impartial, partisan, but not particularistic. When dealing with a conflictual reality, some positions dissimulate society's fundamental contradiction and some reveal it. For Lacanians, the unconscious is the indicator of a problem, of an antagonism, and not simply its hidden truth. The unconscious bears witness to a problematic character of the objective social reality, and not simply the fact that a subject has a problem, a misunderstanding. Psychoanalytic categories like Oedipus complex, enjoyment, jouissance, etc., are usually labeled as ahistoric, eternal, without explanatory competence. It's not true. Lacanians fail better than the historicists, let's say Foucault and Butler, on historizing their concepts and clinical findings. How? Let's consider two epistemological false approaches of historizing our stuff. First of all, it's called the lure of already there, a mechanism according to which when a change manifests itself in the symbolic order of reality, we assume that it was determined to be there forever, eternally, and it's impossible to do our thinking beyond its register. This is false universality of all categories. Historicists, Foucault and Butler, among others, also agree on that. However, second point, these historicists get their figures burned trying to construct a meta-historical vantage point where they can view objectively and compare past and present and uncover, let's say, universalities, which are all by default false for them. They try to construct a before that methodologically transcends the limitations of the present symbolic order. Historicists prefer ignoring that the other, the register of our social reality, contains a signifier of its own lack, its own incompleteness. So they are fooled by the lure, let's say, the lure of the before. By doing this, historical particularists establish an unrealizable ideal of purity, of rather a historical pure distinctions here. We pay good services to Lacanians when Tom does it, if we acknowledge the historicity of our own categories. Lacanians scrutinize contradictions even internally in the oppressed identity and not just externally among masters and oppressed. Truth. Truth is about desire revealed in speech. Structure as an active fiction reveals itself where something insists not to function. Truth is not exactitude. You can tell the truth by means of a lie, to say something that is not correct but produces truth effects. Or you can lie using exactitude. Deception and lies are not the opposite of truth, but inscribed in its text, in the surface, in plain view and not in subconscious depths. The false appearance presented by the analysand are not merely obstacles. We are what we pretend to be, so be careful what you pretend to be, says, I think, Kurt Vonnegut in Month of Night. Truth is not a formalized meta-language that judges from outside the contour of our speech. Truth can be said in the very specific language and not in meta-language. The subject that says a statement is described in this statement. On top of that, when we try to say the truth, we always say something more, an excess inside our interpretation of reality. McGowan, with Lacan, stresses that those who do not let themselves be caught in the symbolic deception in fiction and continue to believe their eyes are the ones who err the most. What the cynic who believes in his eyes misses is the efficiency of the symbolic fiction, the way fiction structures our experience of reality. There is an ontological primacy of the formal structure of the lie, says McGowan. He's not proposing to abandon the idea of truth. What deceives the spectator about the meaning of the events narrated in a film is the structure of the narrative itself, in the form more than in the content. Deceit is a structure, not empirical, in the Kantian sense of the term, let's say. For McGowan, I think along with Lacan, the researching subject does not proceed from ignorance to knowledge. The beginning point is not a blank tabula rasa, but an initial error. Like Christopher Nolan in his film Memento, it's a book of McGowan, proposes that it's only through immersing oneself in the deception that one arrives at the truth. To remove oneself from the deception will cause one to miss the truth altogether. In our research, we have to scrutinize how the ideological subject or the spectator of the film narratively invests in the idea of truth. But the lie also points to the truth that it hides. There is truth, but one arrives at it only by passing through the lie and investing oneself in the fiction. Truth exists as a possibility only if we don't start with an absolute distinction between truth and the fiction from which it emerges. That's where the historicist version of truth has problems. By creating a radical separation between truth and lie, between fiction and reality, they establish an unrealizable idea of purity, of pure truth. A theme of perspectivism emerges in our deployment of truth here. Is the truth about a given configuration a part of this configuration too, or is it something that can be posited or formulated only from the outside this configuration? Nietzsche's motto that there's no truth, there are only perspectives, while it implies that truth is inside the situation and the reverse, is not enough for Lacanians. Not because it's too subjectivistic and relativistic, but on the contrary, because it preassumes that there is a final, solid truth, the truth that there is no truth. This Nietzschean historicist stance of skeptical truth pretends to exist outside life by trying to constitute a metatheoretical level point of view on life, formulated as if from the outside, from the world to which it refers. It's a self-refuting stance against its own particularism. The crucial question for Lacanians, and I think McGowan, maybe it's a red flag for McGowan here, is there a concept of perspectivity that can enable us to break out of the particularistic closet of our perspective without forcing us to adopt a disengaged, relativistic, or dogmatic stance? For McGowan, what structurally escapes every single perspective are not just empirical aspects of the thing that remain until now uncovered in the dark, but the way in which we, as subjects, are inscribed in the thing we are observing. What escapes us in something that has to fall out in order that our perspective to be possible in the first place, an inner edge in the middle of life in social conditions, via slips of tongue, raptures, between the lines, symptoms, crises of reality, all these are places of this truth. Lacanians, and here's a red flag maybe for McGowan, are trying to address within history one perspective that one could call the perspective of truth. Not one already positive perspective that would be more true than the others. This still implies that we have some external measure of truth with which to compare particular perspectival truths. On the contrary, the question is much more radical. Can one conceive of truth as a singular perspective within a given situation that no subject could claim to be her own and belongs to nobody? And although there could be an intrinsic link between this singular perspective and the constitution and every subject belonging to this situation. The Lacanian, historically informed view says yes, it can be done. And this has to do with the fact that the subject is not integrated with itself, that one is fundamentally split from oneself. It's a split subject, let's say. For McGowan, the point of my view, my empirical conscious perspective, and the point of view of the gaze, that is the point of my unconscious desire spotted within a film I'm viewing, do not coincide. And this is registered in the subject's history. There is a lack that we commonly share. McGowan has applied all this in his first books on the concept of the gaze in film theory and beyond it. If the above catchphrase, that the luck that we commonly share, sounds as if it's all Greek to you, we have Todd McGowan with us to explain. Dear Todd, drawing on the title of your recent book, is alienation something to be embraced? Good luck, bro. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that great talk.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I just realized that I forgot to say a few things that have to be said. Nikos, thank you very much for making this link. Thank you very much for introducing some key concepts of Todd McGowan's work, and also for making this link with today's speaker. This is very, very good for the seminar. Todd, the floor is yours. We have plenty of time, almost 45 minutes for your speech, and then we have almost half an hour for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, and thanks, Nikos, for that great what you said. That was amazing. I thought it perfectly kind of led into what I'm going to say, and I am going to talk about this sort of some of the ideas that I flesh out in the book, Embracing Alienation, and the title of my talk is just Subjectivity and Identity. So, one of the important ideas of dialectical thinking is that, and psychoanalytic thinking, is that every speaking being is split between subjectivity and symbolic identity, and the split defines who we are. And how we negotiate this split, I think, determines our political being. And this is what I want to get at today. And when the split disappears from view, our political situation becomes obfuscated. We lose the ability to see the political charge underlying the social order. And we don't foreground this, when we don't foreground this distinction between subjectivity and identity, which I want to flesh out and which I want to show through a recent film called The Substance, which I highly recommend. So subjectivity resides in the distance that one has from oneself. It's the inability that one has to be oneself, to be identical to a name or a position or even identical to a self-image. No one is just the identity assigned to them or even the identity that they take up for themselves. One always relates to one's identity from an uncomfortable distance, from an ungrounded position that can't rely on any external support, any external authority. And this uprootedness of subjectivity, I want to argue, is what gives it its implicit radicality. The subject never fits in the social order because it doesn't fit in with itself. It's always alienated both from itself and from the social order and from its identity that it has in that order. And this alienation of the subject provides the basis for any project of emancipation. Or you might say we can act politically because we don't fit where we are, no matter how vigorously we strive to do so. The problem of subjectivity is, I think, at once the source of its appeal as a political category. The reason why no emancipatory political project can do without reference in some form to subjectivity is because it has this radical core to it. So it's impossible to nail the subject down, to attach it to a place where it belongs. And I think a lot of the previous critiques of the subject in the latter half of the 20th century had this conception of subjectivity as reducible in some way to identity. But I think if you think about this necessary disjunction between them, or dislocation between subjectivity and identity, then the valence of subjectivity turns around 180 degrees. And it's what gives us the ability to act against societal imperatives that bombard us, and even, I think, against biological influence that traverse the subject. So the subject is not a prisoner of its conditions, but can always act otherwise. And I think this is why Louis Althusser's theory of ideology pretty dramatically misses the mark. So according to Althusser, all ideology hails or interpolates concrete individuals as concrete subjects by the functioning of the category of the subject. So for Althusser, subjectivity is the problem. It's the effect of ideology. And the deleterious impact of this statement on the radicality of subjectivity is difficult to overstate. In an effort to dislodge, rightly I think, the sense of self-mastery that accompanies symbolic identity, Althusser ends up taking aim at the wrong target, which is, for him, subjectivity. Subjectivity is what I want to claim is what ideology tries to tame or even eviscerate through the creation of appealing symbolic identities for the subject to embrace and try to identify itself with. So subjectivity is not the product of ideology, but precisely what ideology constantly pits itself against. So the subject is an ideological problem because it doesn't fit within the social order or the ideological construct. And the aim of ideology is to convince subjects that they do belong to their social order, that they do have a place where they fit, they do have an identity that suits them perfectly. But the problem is that this aim never comes off with complete success. And the fundamental status of the subject is precisely its non-belonging. That is, its failure to be at home with itself anywhere, either physically or psychically. And I think this idea of non-belonging tied to the alienation of the subject is the key to any emancipatory project. And this is so to be a subject, one might say, is to always be at odds with what one is prescribed to be. So rather than being the site of ideological interpolation, as Althusser would have it, subjectivity marks the point of emancipation. And its emancipatory power resides in its alienation, this self-distance, this always being not at home with oneself. Although there's a universality of alienation that connects all subjects together, I want to claim, every subject is nonetheless singular in its alienated status. So I think there's a tie between singularity and alienation. Like how you're alienated is what gives you your singularity. So singularity resides in the specific form of failure to be what one is. So you fail in a specific way to be any kind of identity, and that's what makes you singular as a subject. And this singularity doesn't stem, I think this is very important, it doesn't stem from any positive characteristics that the subject has. So not its personality, its specific look, or even any of its idiosyncratic tics, a tic that you think, oh, only this one person has this tic. No, that even the tic can be mocked or imitated. If you've seen like Dana Carvey doing George Bush Sr., he gets all the tics right. And so there's a way in which all those positive characteristics are imitable and exchangeable. So no one is, I would say it this way, no one is positively singular. Singularity is instead the result of the subject's negative relation to itself, the way that it fails to be itself. Or, one could put it a different way, there's a contradiction in every subject that makes it a singular being. And this derives precisely from the subject's inability to be exactly what it is. And I think we see this in the case of people who share a positive characteristic. Let's say they're people that have been sculpted, shaped from a young age to sustain and even enhance their family fortune, born into wealth. And they're born into wealth, they're raised to do their part to contributing. But I think everyone can see that conditioning can never be completely determinative because we can see several different possible responses. So one could just obey and try to heed this demand and try to become what one was made to be. Or another person could abandon it altogether and choose a low-paying profession. They might decide to become a poorly paid university professor instead of a prosperous business figure. Or someone else could just be indifferent to wealth and to act without regard to amassing or disdaining it. And I think you can locate all these different responses in particular aspects of whatever people's personality that drove them to choose the path that they choose. And in this sense, I think subjectivity doesn't reside simply in this, oh, you can choose an alternate path, because the alternate path, the decision to choose it, could be just as unfree as the decision to follow the familial imperative. So it's difficult to see where the path of any kind of radicality lies if one thinks just in these terms. But I think the idea is that the subject's failure to fit doesn't just derive from its ability to act against its ideological programming, to act otherwise, but instead from its unconscious response to its ideological situation. And I think the alienation of the subject is intrinsically linked to its unconscious the unconscious being of subjectivity. So as long as we remain on the level of consciousness, I think then we can't necessarily break convincingly from the cycle of determination. And I think this is one of the things that ultimately undermines Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism, that ultimately he can't and will not think the idea of the unconscious. And so he can't, like, his idea of freedom can always be countered by a opposing determinism. So the opposition between someone like Claude Lévi-Strauss and Sartre, it becomes intractable, because how do you navigate that? Precisely because Sartre can't found the idea of freedom or subjectivity on its unconscious dimension. So the conscious choice, even when it involves a rejection or inversion of some kind of ideological demand, can't abandon the terrain that the demand lays down. So our conscious response is always on the given terrain, and thus in a certain sense conditioned or maybe even determined. So the demand conditions all the possible conscious responses to it and precludes any radical response on the level of consciousness. So one might say that consciousness is manipulable in this way because it operates according to interest. So although I might consciously assume an indifferent attitude to some kind of social imperative, I do so in order to follow my own interests consciously. So my interest lies, say, in rejecting this pursuit of wealth because I value intellectual inquiry and developing solid friendships instead of the accumulation of capital. But as long as I follow my interest, I'm not breaking from the logic of the demand of the other, this control that the ideology has over me. So what's interesting, I think, is if we think about it in terms of the unconscious, not only is such a break possible, but it's actually unavoidable, because my unconscious response to any societal imperative always evinces my singularity as a subject. And I think that's something that even Freud himself doesn't fully have a sense of, because he thinks of the unconscious as the site of complete determination. And I want to say, no, actually, the unconscious is the site of our freedom, not of our it's the site where we break from, at least from societal determinations, and even from, I think, biological ones. So my unconscious response to ideology, I want to say, holds the key to my subjectivity and to any kind of emancipatory project that we can come up with. The difficulty with the subject's singularity is that it doesn't derive from the subject's conscious relation to ourselves. So our conscious designs necessarily follow a script given to us by the social structure, the social authority. So some kind of other makes demands on us, dictates a range of possibilities, and we consciously decide to take up a position within these demands. So in making conscious decisions, we always operate on the terrain of the other, the ideology and its demands. It's only through our unconscious response, which is why that's what I think we should pay attention to, that we alter the rules that ideology lays down. So obviously, I don't think the unconscious is universally radical or emancipatory, because it often leads us to obey more than we consciously wish, or even to undermine our efforts at challenging the power of ideology. But the form of the unconscious, this is what I'm interested in. The fact that it is structured around loss rather than interest, the fact that it constantly challenges and topples the good, I think that's what gives it its emancipatory potential, a potential that we lose, I think, when we don't center our political projects around our alienated subjectivity. So subjectivity is inherently alienated. It's inherently difficult to bear, which is one reason I think that political projects tend to turn away from it. It constantly confronts us with the absence of any mastery and with the lack of any stable foundation. As a result, we turn to symbolic identities to provide respite for the subject's alienation. So there's a sense of stability and security to symbolic identity because it always operates with some symbolic authority backing it, some social authority giving it a pseudo quasi foundation. The other's recognition, in other words, underlies every symbolic identity that I might take up. So it's always this dependent upon the other. And this recognition is precisely what makes symbolic identity attractive and what gives me the sense that I've achieved validation in the eyes of the other when I have this symbolic identity. But I want to say that it's precisely this validation from the other that renders symbolic identity necessarily conformist. Adhering to one's symbolic identity at the expense of one's subjectivity cuts into the subject's freedom, and as a symbolic identity, one follows the dictates of the other and bases one's actions on the foundation, on the foundation of the other, rather than acting without a foundation for what one does, which I think is necessarily, that's what is emancipatory, this acting without a foundation. So we don't experience symbolic identity as if it represents adherence to the dictates of the other, which is why it's so deceptive and also alluring for the subject. So I know, for instance, someone else gave me my name, but I use it so often to refer to myself that I begin to experience it as my own. I cease to associate it with the other that has named me and think, this is just me. This is who I am. And this deception, I think, is even more extreme when it comes to profession or career or job even. In some cases maybe, I'm able to choose the job that appeals to me. And I do so without recognizing that the social authority lays out different employment possibilities for me and even conditions me towards specific ones. In the case of my ethnic or national symbolic identity, the power of the other over that is very clear, I think. And yet I still experience this identity as inherent to who I am. I still feel myself as American or whatever. So despite our experience of symbolic identity as integral to us, it has the effect of eviscerating our freedom whenever we invest ourselves in it. So we strive to fit into a position that the other creates without regard for the singularity of our own form of satisfaction, which is tied to our subjectivity and to our unconscious. We end up abandoning the question of subjectivity for the ready-made answer of various forms of symbolic identity. And in the process, we lose touch with who we are as subjects, and or one might say, we betray the problem that animates us. No one can do without symbolic identity altogether. There's no such thing as a pure subject, a subject existing without any degree of recognition from the other. Although it's misleading, symbolic identity does provide the basis for our social orientation, and without any investment in symbolic identity, we'd have no sense of even how to walk down the street or talk to our neighbors. We wouldn't be able to have unable to have any social structure at all. And in this sense, it's not simply an oppressive category, symbolic identity, but instead, it also provides the social guidepost necessary for any degree of interaction. But the problem is that our investment in it has a deleterious effect on our status as free subjects and on our political situation, our political being. And I think the first step toward the politicization of the subject is discovering the split between subjectivity and symbolic identity, that I am not any of the symbolic identities that I occupy. All political being, it's my argument, derives from subjectivity, not from symbolic identity, which is the force that tries to keep us in a social place and provide the illusion that there's a foundation beneath everything that we do within the symbolic order. And grasping the necessity of symbolic identity must go hand in hand with challenging the investment in it. So we see, okay, it is necessary, but at the same time, it has to be challenged. And the theoretical task, I think, to do this is to make evident the split between the subject and its identity. So one of the most important efforts that political theorists make is their insistence that no one is reducible to their symbolic identity. And we can see this in political thinkers of many different stripes. They try to accomplish this in different ways and with different formulations. So one might think on behalf of the feminist struggle, Simone de Beauvoir separates female subjects from the symbolic identity of women. And I think this is the sense of her famous claim, one is not born but rather becomes woman. No biological, psychic, or economic destiny defines the figure that the human female takes on in society. It is civilization as a whole that elaborates this intermediary product between the male and the eunuch that is called feminine. So her point is, okay, there's subjectivity, the subjectivity of women, and then there's the symbolic identity of femininity, and she's trying to say, let's see the divide between that. And that's a political intervention step. By drawing attention to the social process that generates femininity as a symbolic identity, Beauvoir, again, is trying to draw attention to this split and to demonstrate that these symbolic accoutrements of femininity don't have a necessary hold over us. And this is what makes her intervention political in the feminist struggle. And I think we can see a similar thing in the fight against racism. So rather than champion blackness as a source of symbolic identity that should have equal standing with whiteness, which we see a lot of the time, I think, Karen and Barbara Fields, in their great book, Racecraft, claim that race as a source of symbolic identity is the product of the racist act. And this is, maybe it's obvious, but I think it's you can see the parallel between what they're saying and Simone de Beauvoir is saying. And I think it often gets, and this is their point, it often gets forgotten that it's the racist act that produces racism, it's not the fact that we have race that creates racism. So to invest oneself wholly in the symbolic identity of a race is to succumb, they want to argue, to the racist structure, even if one's trying to fight it. So the invocation of racial difference obscures the subjectivity involved in the racist act, which is what we should be focused on. So it's hiding identity, it's hiding this racist act that's behind every racial identity. And this is what occurs, they think, whenever anyone speaks about race without talking about racism. So their point is, anytime you mention race, you have to mention racism, which is the thing that's causing it to appear as race. So this is what they say. Race appears as a neutral description of reality because of the racism evasion, that is talking about race instead of racism, through which immoral acts of discrimination disappear and then reappear camouflaged as the victim's alleged difference. That is, that difference in some ways is what produces racism. So identity is rooted in racial difference. Emerges for them only against the backdrop of the racist act. So in invocations of racial identity participate, according to the Field sisters, in this racism evasion, an evasion that hides the political act, this act of subjectivity, lurking behind the identity claim. And they write their book Racecraft to bring this evasion to light and emphasize the distinction between the politics of the subject and the ideological assurances of symbolic identity. So when we lose track of the split, we also lose track of our political being. And at the same time, we derail this emancipatory project of universal freedom and equality. Universality has its basis in alienated subjectivity. So what we have in common with all other subjects is not our shared humanity, but our shared alienation, which is why this idea of fail better is such an appealing one, I think. So our ability to be, it's what we have in common is our inability to be what we are. So our failure of being self-identical. As subjects, we have this universal connection with all other subjects, and this universality appears through our collective distance from whatever identity might be imposed upon us. So you can see a kind of struggle between symbolic identity and subjectivity is mirrored by a struggle between universality and particularity. So universality is what is tied to our singularity, but symbolic identity is always conformist. So even when we experience identity as our own, something we've sculpted for ourselves, its dependence on symbolic recognition is what ties it to the other. That's why an identity can never have an emancipatory function. And the search for an identity that fully corresponds to who we are is an attempt to cure alienation and overcome universality. And this is why all identitarian projects exhibit a horror of universality. They want to stick to a certain kind of particularity and don't want to give themselves over to the universal, because the universal gives the lie to the identity and undermines its pretensions to completion because it's tied to the necessary alienation of the subject. And this is what identity is constantly obscuring by making the subject appear equal to its identity, by blurring this distinction between subject and identity. So while the subject is out of joint with itself, identity creates the appearance of coincidence, even if it's one of an identity of, say, permanent flux or whatever. So it's only by recognizing the identity as a failure that we remain within the question of subjectivity, which is the terrain of the universal. And to do so, I think, is to make a home out of this constitutive alienation of subjectivity, to embrace being out of place as the only possible relationship to one's particular community. So one's always disjoint to that community. But doing so, I think, requires being comfortable with being uncomfortable, if I can put it that way. Only by accomplishing this can we sustain the universal problem of subjectivity without rushing toward a solution that will always make matters worse. And I want to turn to a little film that shows this, I think, really well. Coralie Forgeat's The Substance, which was just released within the month. Because it's a film that, interestingly, I think, confronts this division between subjectivity and symbolic identity by depicting its main character named Elizabeth Sparkle, who's played by Demi Moore, literally splitting herself in two. So the film, in a certain way, makes a very straightforward feminist point about the ruling societal demand for female beauty that is placed upon women, and how that, and the pressure that puts on women to create a separate aspect of themselves. But I don't think that that's not true in the film, but I want to get at the way in which the film is playing out this relationship and highlighting this relationship between subjectivity and identity. So Elizabeth Sparkle is a Hollywood star with an Oscar. She has her own television show, which is an exercise show. But the aging process when she turns 50 takes her out of the public eye and puts an end to her career. And her male boss named Harvey, it's clearly like Harvey Weinstein, is played by Dennis Quaid in a very effectively repulsive way, tells her no one wants to see a woman on screen when she turns 50. And so she's distraught. But in response, she turns to a mystery drug that will create a new and younger version of herself that's separate from herself. So the emergence of this new self, who ends up naming herself Sue during an audition, gives Elizabeth Sparkle, the Demi Moore character, a completely divided life. So she lives out 1 week as her younger self, and then 1 week as her older self. And this younger self kind of comes out of her back in a very grotesque way. It's a film of body horror, a little like a David Cronenberg film. But ultimately, this relationship, I'm not giving it away because one knows this film is not headed to a happy ending from the moment it begins. Ultimately, the arrangement breaks down, and it ends up turning Elizabeth Sparkle into a monstrous-looking figure that struggles to her death on top of her star on Hollywood Boulevard, which is actually where the opening shot of the film takes place as well. So Forgeat makes clear that the beauty ideal linked to the symbolic identity of femininity, especially that of the star, ends up destroying the subjectivity of the woman invested in it. So in addition to this clear feminism, I think, lies an equally powerful claim about the relationship between subjectivity and symbolic identity. And I really like how the film is absolutely highlighting this separation. And I think that's the political charge of the film, that this is a claim, obviously, it doesn't just hold for women, but for all subjects, that the film shows the more we invest ourselves in symbolic identity, this younger version of herself that becomes a star, the more we destroy our subjectivity. And investment in the former involves the evisceration of the latter. So Elizabeth Sparkle learns about the substance that she'll use to transform herself after a traffic accident sends her to the hospital. And I think the conditions of this accident are themselves pretty interesting. So she's driving home after she's lost her television show job. And while driving, she looks up at workers taking down a billboard with her face on it. And the image falls to the ground. Then a car crashes violently into her because she's distracted. Maybe she's run a red light or something. We don't know. And then the next scene depicts her relatively unhurt in the hospital, but a young nurse comes up to her and clues her into the existence of a substance which she promises will revitalize her life. So Forgeat's point here, I think, is that the confrontation with the loss of symbolic identity, so the face of the falling from the billboard, places the Elizabeth Sparkle, the Demi Moore character, in this position that leads to her to this drug called the substance, which is what will restore her symbolic identity, but steal it from her subjectivity. So it's a really fascinating depiction of how this Faustian pact gets made. We see the image falling to the ground. So the substance as a film envisions the relationship between subjectivity and symbolic identity as a zero-sum game. That is, what symbolic identity gains in terms of time and investment, subjectivity loses. So Elizabeth Sparkle represents in the film the subject. She's a subject now almost completely bereft of any symbolic identity. She never can't even leave her apartment except to pick up the new weekly supply of the substance. While her alter ego, her other self, her symbolic identity, Sue, is really nothing but a symbolic identity. So she enjoys the accolades of everyone she encounters, and everyone loves her. She's a famous star almost immediately. She has sex with young, attractive men, and she experiences almost no disapprobation. The one moment when she comes to the set to find it abandoned, so she comes to go to work to do her show, and she fears, I've lost the other's recognition. But then it turns out she's actually become an even bigger star and got in a better show, and everything's fine. So, but on the other hand, the character, the older Elizabeth Sparkle, the Demi Moore figure, lives in complete social isolation. And I think the film's mise en scène nicely highlights the loneliness of life lived within the confines of her apartment. And at one point, she plans to meet a man who knew her from high school and recognized her on the street. But she can't even leave her apartment because she feels she doesn't look good enough. And she's constantly feeling like this. She doesn't have any symbolic identity at all. So the film is saying this is almost a pure form of subjectivity in contrast to this near pure form of symbolic identity. And I think the film does one of the best jobs I've seen of creating this contrast between what pure subjectivity would look like and what pure symbolic identity would look like, even though these are obviously impossible positions. We never experience them in their purity. But I think the contrast is telling. But the key moment in the film occurs when the younger figure, Sue, the symbolic identity, she's in the midst of a sexual encounter, and it's time for her to change back. So they alternate every week. It's time for her to change back. And she decides to overstay her limit. So she's having sex, and she goes the over limit. She steals a little more fluid from Elizabeth Sparkle's back, which is what keeps her animated. And then she stays on an extra day. But this extra day ends up initiating a transition in Elizabeth Sparkle. So Elizabeth Sparkle wakes up the next day and she finds her index finger and part of her hand shriveled up. They look like the hand and the finger of a 90-year-old woman. Nothing like the rest of her body. She's only supposed to be 50 years old. So this extra day that Sue, the symbolic identity, took ends up having a direct cost of the vitality of the figure of Elizabeth Sparkle. So it's as if the film is saying symbolic identity exists on the basis of the psychic energy that it subtracts from our subjectivity. So we learn that anything any damage that she has is irreversible, and she could end the treatment. She doesn't do it. So she's still invested in this symbolic identity, even if it's destroying her, it ends up completely destroying her. So after the next switch, this younger figure of Sue becomes completely addicted to the success of her career, and it's going to culminate in hosting a New Year's Eve special. But as a result, she so overstays her time that she sucks more and more fluid from the shriveling body of Elizabeth Sparkle. Finally, the night of the performance, the fluid dries up completely, which necessitates that Sue restore Sparkle to consciousness in order to rebuild the fluid. But all the extraction has turned Elizabeth Sparkle into this decrepit figure, barely able to move. She's hunched over. She's almost totally bald. But what's interesting is even in this terrible state where she's barely alive, she can't end the treatment because she ends up having second thoughts. She revives this younger figure of Sue, her symbolic identity, who then proceeds to brutally kill her. So then the subjectivity is killed. And this demise of the subject comes from the investment in symbolic identity. So I think the film nicely illustrates the psychic cost of our investment in symbolic identity in very physical terms, that we see the degradation of Elizabeth Sparkle's body that allows Sue's body to continue garnering recognition. So the other's recognition appears revitalizing to those experiencing it, but it sucks the life out of our subjectivity because it diverts our attention to the other. And it tempts us into believing that the other can provide us with a substantial ground for our existence, that the other's recognition indicates concern or even genuine love when it doesn't at all. So it's interesting. So the beginning and end of Farjah's film make evident the vacuity of recognition. So the substance begins with an overhead shot of workers creating Elizabeth Sparkle's star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. When they finish, we see people initially lavish attention on this landmark and implicitly on Sparkle herself. But as the years go by, attention wanes until it finally disappears. And finally, someone drops a hamburger laden with ketchup on the star, leaving a kind of disgusting mess. And this shot of Sparkle's star with a disgusting mess on it comes back in the final shot. So after Sue kills Sparkle, she has no more vitality. So she ends up trying some more of the substance on herself to regenerate the subject. And when she does, this decrepit figure of Elizabeth Sparkle emerges. She's completely monstrous. She has an arm coming out of her back, an extra face, and her own face is grossly disfigured. And she ends up going to this New Year's Eve special where she's gonna be the star, and she comes up on the stage and as this disgusting, monstrous figure, and the public attacks her and ends up brutally cutting her into pieces. And as the film ends, we see basically her face propelling itself along Hollywood Boulevard, where she ends up dying on top of her own Hollywood star, and she ends up looking a lot like this hamburger and ketchup that opened the film. So what's interesting is that this underlies, I think, nicely the insufficiency of the other's recognition. To have it, so even to become a star on Hollywood Boulevard is to have nothing at all. So symbolic identity marks the point at which the other takes from the subject. The recognition that it gives back in return is completely empty because the other has no substantial identity at all. It exists only through the investment that the subject makes in it, not through its own force. And I think one of the things that the way I envision the political project of emancipation is that we have to think, like, constantly keep in mind the idea of a division between subjectivity and symbolic identity. And I think too often politics ends up getting weighed down in the problem of a symbolic identity that we're going to take up, and we lose sight of subjectivity. And the key, I think, is to sustain this distance. And I think that's one of the great achievements of the substance. I think that's the real political project, like making clear the distance between subjectivity and symbolic identity and seeing the way in which the political charge lies on the side of subjectivity. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Todd, for this very thought-provoking speech and lecture. It was amazing. I really mean it. I will take advantage of my role as a coordinator. Sure. Yeah. We have plenty of time in order to discuss, and thank you very much, Todd, also for giving us time to reflect on these thoughts. For some of us, maybe we are familiar with concepts like subjectivity and identity, but even so, your elaboration on the issue of subjectivity and alienation that actually constitutes the subject, and we have to embrace that fact, not to deny it, not to neglect it or oppress it, if I think it right. Sure. It's the key for any emancipatory politics. And I had also the privilege to read your book, after Nikos suggested it to me. So it was also a wonderful reading. I enjoyed it very much. So I will straightforwardly go to my questions that appeared after reading the book and after your presentation. I couldn't agree more that alienation constitutes the subject, as you said. This radical dislocation of the subject is part and parcel of subjectivity. It cannot be otherwise. Because we fail to assume a full identity, we are in need of identifications all the time. We cannot say, okay, I will stop identifying. I will stop claiming an identity. It's not an option. But it's an option what to do with this, your need, with this desperate need to invest in identities, in symbolic identity. I totally agree with that. But it seems that claiming an identity, it seems as if there is one mode of identifying with the other. It seems from what you've said, it seems to downplay a bit the fact that there are at least two basic and distinct ways of identifying with something else and with ourselves too. Of course, I imply the basic distinction between imaginary and symbolic identification. And to make a long story short, the symbolic identification is when you identify with the history of something else, with the structure. And the imaginary, if I understand it well, is when you are obsessed with an image. And for example, Derek Hook has mentioned Speedy Gonzales, you know, the cartoon, the famous cartoon, as a very good illustration of how this distinction works, because Speedy sustains a full identity of an image of a creature that runs a lot. It's very speedy. In contrast, Gonzales is another story of identification. It has a history, it's a name, and it has a family history. There is a structure. There is nothing totalizing in Gonzales. It is open in negotiation. So would you say that it's also important to sustain this distinction between imaginary and symbolic identification? How would you see it to enter into this discussion on alienation? This is the first thing. Another question about modernity and, let's say, late modernity or hypermodernity. To my view, late modernity or the neoliberal discourse of subjectivity, the neoliberal subject, let's say, is the omnipotent subject that can and should continually rediscover itself. So the mandate is not, okay, you have to fully grasp a symbolic identity and this will be yours and that's all. Is that you have to be a protean subject. You have to be flexible enough in order to change identities. So how this discourse is actually could actually be combined with your critique on symbolic identities. And you very correctly, I think, in your book, you are mentioning publics, that we can imagine how we could embrace alienation when we are in public and not in a community. if you could also elaborate on that stream of thought, I found it very, 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 very productive. That's all. That's my
okay.
Thank you very, very much for that.
No, those are great questions, and I think so. I'll start in reverse order. Like, I think that the idea of the public is really, yeah, it's crucial. And I think that I think it's really interesting, right? Like, I think this, and maybe this is a 20th century way of thinking about that the public is, and certainly like Heidegger, and even, I mean, as early as Kierkegaard, like the idea of like the public is associated with das Mann and the force of conformity, right? And I actually think that that's wrong, and I think that it's that the public is constituted by the coming together of alienated subjects instead. And I think like the force of like das Mann or the they or whatever, like that, the big other in Lacanian terms, like I think that is actually always a private force. And I think that's what's kind of missed in this 20th century existentialist critique of the public, right? And even up to Hannah Arendt. So I feel like that there wasn't this, so I think that there is this interesting alignment between universality and the alienation of subjectivity. And then, but the public is in a way, I want to say, is anti-conformist, right? Like when you're in public, you experience your alienation. And one of the things I talk about in the book that you mentioned, Embracing Alienation, is that like when you're in a public park or whatever, or on a bus, you can't decide who you're going to sit next to. Like you're just haphazardly, like contingently next to anybody. And I think that can be very alienating, but I think that's also constitutive of that public sphere. So I think that's really, really absolutely crucial to the, then that's why I think that in a way, like the emancipatory project is about creating a public too, in addition to like sustaining subjectivity. It's about creating a public. And yeah, about the question about the difference between imaginary and symbolic identification. Yeah, sure. I think that's definitely, and I like the Speedy Gonzalez example. That's kind of creative and good. What I find interesting though, is I think that both of them, Lacan has this line in Seminar 2, the ego seminar, where he says the imaginary is always hooked on the symbolic. And so I think the only thing I would say is I don't think that imaginary identification works without the symbolic underpinning. And so I think there's always this so in that sense, I think the distinction, I respect the idea of the distinction, but on the other hand, I think in a certain way, both suffer from the same problem. But I like what you said about Gonzalez, that you have this kind of like their whole history, and so there's a sort of openness and the kind of, the only thing I would say is I think the way that we think of the way that like a name like Gonzalez functions for us, I think that we're using that as in a foundational way, and we kind of tend to forget the openness. But I think what you're saying is, well, isn't there a way to think about identification with the real attached to it, like the real kind of openness, the failure? And yeah, for sure. But that, I would just say, if you think about identification that way, that is symbolic, that is subjectivity, right? Like that's what subjectivity is, precisely this like real moment within every identification. So so I don't feel a disagreement there. I feel like that's where I would situate what I'm saying. The most interesting thing you said to me, all were great, but I really like this protean self idea, and like, oh, well, wait a minute. So isn't, like, one could say, like, isn't our society now already doing kind of what I'm saying? Because you're taught to like give up symbolic identity whenever you want. You can be one symbolic identity today and another one tomorrow. You can create your own gender. You can do all these. So, okay. But the point is, like, you're still, I think it's interesting, because I think the situation is even more exacerbated than it was in the era of the organization man, right? Like, it's because the more you feel like you have control over that symbolic identity, the more it doesn't feel like an oppressive symbolic identity, and the more you betray your subjectivity for that symbolic identity. So I feel like the protean nature gives us the illusion that it's coming from us, when it's still, the possibilities are still already always dictated by the other. So I think that to me is really interesting, but I think it's a symptom of this, the way in which the problem has gotten worse, not better, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So now, yes, I will give the floor to Nikos for his first question, and then everybody else that would like to join in commenting or asking a question, please raise your hand. Thank you. Yes, Nikos.
Yes, it was very thought-provoking also. I just wanted to ask you, Todd, it's a question that we have elaborated before, maybe 1 year before. It seems that you are developing a kind of universality of laws, a universality of alienation, a universality of lack. In distinction to, and you play your game in the, let's say, in the terrain of the desire. In distinction to your to this kind of thinking, maybe are the Zizekians, Lacanian of the Zizekstrand and Zupancis and the others, that mostly they seem to do not like just to talk about the universality of lack. They are speaking something about universality is in the antagonism itself. They are talking about the logic of the drive. Maybe they find this it's too. Do you think that is the positive, let's say positivism, because they want to speak about drive and not desire and lack and all that stuff? Maybe you see if they are too particularistic and not universal enough, if they speak about the logic of the drive and not about the community of things that we commonly do not have. That is your option of the your reading of Lacan. Is there a distinction between this? Because there is a short circuit between singularity and universality, and sounds different in your thinking than the Zizekians.
Yeah, I think Nikos. I think that's a really it's a great observation, and I think that Slavo and I kind of go around and around on this question when we're talking. Like, I think that I mean, I don't know that he thinks that I'm a kind of a prophet. He said this, like a prophet of lack or something. But I mean, I feel like I guess one of the key things for me is that, and I think this is what alienation is that, and this is why I think it's not just lack, but I have a shirt that says just lack on it, so I could have been wearing that. That would have been more appropriate. But I feel like one of the key ideas for me is that, and this is what alienation is that it is precisely the fact that we're lacking that makes us excessive. So I feel like that's why it's not just like lack, because it's this coincidence of lack and excess that's what our alienation is. And the other thing I would say about antagonism, because I think you're right that for them, for Slavoj for sure, and probably for Alenka, it's a universality of antagonism, right? And I just think it's important to make the distinction between like the universality of alienation or contradiction and antagonism, because I feel like one of the key ideas for me is that there absolutely cannot be, like, there can't be an emancipatory project with an enemy. And I fear that the idea of antagonism needs an enemy, right? And so I feel like what I like about the Hegelian idea of contradiction is that that there can't, like, for Hegel, the enemy, it's that you haven't seen the way in which your activity has produced the position that makes the enemy possible. Not that there's not times that you have adversaries that have to be confronted and even maybe fought and maybe even killed. But the point is, you can't treat them like an enemy, because when you treat someone like an enemy, you're creating a symbolic identity for yourself, right? Like you're using them to constitute a symbolic identity. And so I guess that's my worry about the notion of antagonism, that it needs whereas contradiction is an internal, like internal fissure, right? Like an internal rupture rather than, and then that manifests itself as an external. But I think antagonism strikes me as a, like the way it's historically been laid out, I think has always been this kind of external struggle that needs the enemy. And so that's my worry about that. But I don't think it's that, to be truth be told, I just said all that, and I actually don't think it's that different. Like I think that it kind of gets exaggerated probably by Slavoj mostly just to have a little spat. But I think it's not, I don't think it's that different. I think we kind of agree. So.
Thank you very much, Nikos. If you could lower your hand now, and we'll give the floor to the speech to Yannis Stavrakakis.
Thank you, Giorgos, and thanks a lot, Todd, for this fascinating talk. I wanted to mention something that, in fact, puzzles me lately, which has to do, and this will lead me to a question regarding the framework you have presented, this choreography and this opposition between identity and subjectivity and so on and so forth. So my main idea is whether we should complexify a little bit this schema and make it a triad, maybe, by including something that Bataille had mentioned from the 30s, the object-objection. And of course, this has been also debated by Kristeva and other people, and it's quite in vogue lately. But these might correspond, in my view, with a particular observation. I mean, if you observe the contemporary climate and the contemporary landscape, we have increasingly people and whole chunks of people, millions of people who seem to follow neither the ideological course of fixity tied to identity, nor the other course of subjectivity, but are completely invisible. So if you have experienced violent downward social mobility, if you have been experiencing forced migration, if you have and then you end up in a situation in which you don't want to be visible at all, you don't want to have any public visibility, you don't vote, and now we have 60% abstention. We have people who don't want to vote, who don't want to talk about politics. In Greece, we are experiencing that. I mean, if you upload a post in Facebook about a political issue, you get 2 likes. If you upload a picture of a cat, you get 100 likes. Or maybe, and most people maybe are neither in Facebook, nor put any likes, nor are not interested in talking about politics, in adopting one ideological position, or a non-ideal, or doing anything about that. And we don't know anything about them. They're completely invisible. And reading the text by Bataille on objections from the 30s, they seem to resonate with this picture, because he talks about people who are so crushed by the system that they cannot even think clearly. They don't even want to identify with anything. And I was wondering whether, of course, from a Lacanian perspective and from what we have been debating for ages, this is a little bit problematic, maybe. Okay, they have some sort of identification. They try to do something about it, maybe, and so on. But I was wondering whether increasingly this contemporary climate requires that we conceptualize somehow this condition of objection, that somebody is entering this twilight zone. And I would like to have your opinion about that.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of anticipated what I'm going to say. I think, like, I think that I do appreciate the reference to Bataille, and I think Bataille there's a lot of fecundity there. But I think that, I think it's different. It's different, obviously, as a form of symbolic identity, and it is certainly like a position of kind of like you're sort of almost in the position of outsider, right? Like you don't have any kind of symbolic investments, but I think there's still a kind of like even not far from my home, there's a homeless encampment, which is kind of like close to this idea, right? And there's still a kind of symbolic identity attached to that, right? Like I understand what you're saying, but I guess the two things. I don't see it as that different, I guess, than a kind of because it's a degraded symbolic identity, a humiliated one, but it's still a symbolic identity. But the other thing I think, I don't see the political gain from thinking of it as a third category. Like I feel like one of the mistakes of the left in the 20th century, to me, Herbert Marcuse would be the figure of this, right? Is to say, oh, it's from the most ostracized, the most degraded populations, not from the proletariat, that the revolution is going to come. I mean, this is Marcuse's thesis. And so I just think that's not right. Like, that's just wrong, because I think, ironically, and this is not a judgment either way, but I think, ironically, being completely degraded does not politicize one, right? It doesn't make one as a revolutionary subject. Like, it doesn't. It almost has the opposite effect. And I think that's what you're saying, right? About the likes and the clicks, right? Like, I think it really takes you out of the political terrain. And so I feel like that's what symbolic identity is trying to do also. Like, that's what every symbolic identity is trying to do. It's trying to depoliticize you as a subject. That's the whole point. So I guess, let me just one more little hobby horse. Like, I feel like there's a little danger of like Agambenizing those people, right? Like, for Agamben, like the Musulmen in the camps are like the model of contemporary identity, and they're stripped of any subjectivity or any identity altogether, and they've become bare life. I just think I think for a speaking subject, one is never in the situation of bare life. I just think that's a complete misreading, misinterpretation of the situation. And I feel that's the danger of that, adding objection as a third category. But in general, if you write a book on this, I'll be very eager to read it. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Giannis. And before I give the speech to any other member of this session that would like to comment something, I would like to make an acknowledgement to Yannis Stavrakakis, who I think that without his work, the Lacanian legacies would be more obscure than they are for us. I mean, the Greek audience, because Yannis has written some really enlightening works on how to piecemeal appropriate some points in Lacanian thought in political theory. So thank you very much on this occasion. Now,
George, we also have a question from George Bouzikaris in the chat.
A question in the chat that I cannot see. Would you like George to?
I can read it.
Of course.
I can read it.
Okay.
Yes, but we can read it for everyone else as well. He says,
I'll read it out loud to everybody. No, I'll read it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, what about the bodily aspects of identity and subjectivity? What is the relationship between identity, subjectivity, and embodiment? Good. I thought someone would ask this. I think the obviously, I think one of the great things about Freud, I think maybe his greatest contribution, is to say that that we're not just that we're not like, I think he's the way that he approaches the mind-body problem, I think is really original and unsurpassed. And it's that, so the body is subjected to, or put into, collides with a certain symbolic social structure, and that collision then produces, and this is Nikos was making references, produces drives, and like the drive is the result of this collision between bodily impulses and the social symbolic structure. So subject to, in this, and the drive, the drive is unconscious. It is essential to subjectivity. So the body is always on the side of the subject, right? Like, of course, there are ways in which it becomes symbolically situated, but it's not the body in a pure form. The body of the subject as a body is the subject that's been distorted or rendered out of shape by its subjection to the symbolic structure. So I don't think, I guess from my perspective, I don't think we can just talk about the body. Like, the body is precise, like subjectivity is essentially tied to the body, but it isn't reducible to the body, because it emerges through this collision between just this human body and this social structure. So the symbolic structure. So I don't think I'm punting on that question. I feel like that's the idea. Yeah.
Thank you very much, George, for this question.
Yeah. And I'd add something to that.
Yes, Nikos, please.
Usually the Lacanians say that your body comprises three things. One is the organism, okay, the physical body, the image of your body, and on top of that, there is the signifier, the cut in the body that makes you not being a whole. So there is not one body, there are three things. It's the reverse of the body language. Language is not body language, it's language body, something like that. So there's an organism, there's a signifier, cut, and the image that you have of wholeness and completeness. Okay, just.
Yeah.
That's very good.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Mm-hmm. Thank you for this clarification, Nikos. From a Lacanian perspective, also Nikos also has written some things about these echoes of Lacanian political theory. So we have still some time. So is there any other who would like to say something? Yes, George. Please.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much. I think that my question derives from, in a way, the core of your argument. I mean, this idea of subjectivity being in a constant conflict, or at least tension, with the symbolic, with the alienated symbolic, or at least, if not constant, in a conflict that is constantly reproduced. So subjectivity is always in a conflict with what is recognized by others, as you said, let alone by ourselves as an identity. Then again, if not recognized, if subjectivity is not recognized, how can it be shared at all? I mean, how can subjectivity be political, and as you said, the source of politicization, if it cannot be shared? Or to put it differently, how can we think of a form of sharing, I mean of sharing opinions or values or worldviews, desires, of course, or even sharing contradicting goals and so on, that does not involve recognition? Is there perhaps a form of sharing that is beyond recognition?
Yeah, that's exactly what I would say. Exactly what I'd say. Like, I think that what's shared is precisely our alienation, right? Like, that's what's most fundamentally shared between us. And I think that's to me what's universal. And so yeah, I think you're right. Like, of course, it has to be able to be shared, or else it can't be political. But I feel like I don't think it's right to think that recognition is political. Like, I think recognition is a way of like eliminating the political edge. And actually, I think recognition, like in a way it's shared, right? But in another way, I think it can't be universally shared, right? It has to be, if recognition isn't prejudicial, it doesn't work as recognition. That is, if it's not some recognition to one and less to another, then it loses its value as recognition. So I think that's the trap of recognition. But I definitely agree with you that subjectivity, but I think it is shared. I think we do share our alienation all the time with each other. Like we even in little, I almost wanted to say it's just a change of focus, right? Like it's just like are you, like when you're like just even in the stupidest interaction, like, hi, how are you doing? Like can you see the way in which there's an alienated subject in that interaction, and like and bring that to the fore in these interactions, rather than like trying to find the respite of symbolic identity? So yeah, I think it absolutely has to be shared, but that is what's fundamentally shared about us. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Okay.
Can I add something to that, maybe, and add something to this
Sure.
question that George has?
Yes, and then the speech goes to Dimitris.
Fine. Just one point, because Lacan does not speak about subjectivity. This is Foucauldian. Lacan speaks about subject. The subject, I encounter you as a subject at this specific spot that you doubt yourself. When yourself is a problem for you, then I encounter you. Not when I have a totalizing image, you are exotic, and I have an image of you and it's complete and closed. Is the spot where you doubt yourself. You are inconsistent with yourself. That's Foucault. That's Lacan and not Foucault. And also, it's nice to have a look on the pathologies of recognition of let's say Axel Honneth and currently of Arto Laitinen and these guys who speak about pathologies in a way that try to include the body within recognition, and not speaking about justice on top of the above, to judge the others from above if there is recognition or not, but to check the pathologies of recognition. This is an interesting view on social psychology on this. Arto Laitinen is a guy that's where he's in the line of thought of critical theory and Axel Honneth. So Lacan says subject and not subjectivity and recognition. It's not enough for him. That's all. Let's stop.
Yes, thank you, Nikos. That's right. I also was thinking that recognition presupposes a demand, a claim, a request, but sharing alienation is another way of relating to others, as I can see it. So thank you very much. And now the Dimitris Tsiribas would like to say something. Thank you.
Thank you, first of all, for the thought-provoking points. I want to continue this line of arguments and questions. So based on the ideal, not ideal, really, but on the need to sustain the distance between subjectivity and symbolic identity. If we think of those using the dimensions of belief, which is a structural necessity, as you have written about, and the dimension basically of truth, symbolic truth. And if we keep in mind that there is no belief without the symbolic truth, there's no contingency without necessity. I want to ask, so since you mentioned in your speech the dimension of interests, how would this dimension would be reformulated in this constellation? So And we think that, we keep in mind that every truth, every symbolic truth, is necessarily a line truth. How could we, if we could, conceive of maybe the notion of a line true interest in this project of political emancipation?
Yeah, that's really good. Like, I think that's, I mean, I think you kind of outlined how it would be conceived, right? Like that we would see the way in which the claim of interest is itself the lie, in the sense that it's the way of avoiding the universality of alienation, right? Like every claim for a kind of interest imagines that I am just reducible to my symbolic identity and that I can pursue my self-interest and that I don't have an unconscious, right? Like, I think that's so I think always looking at the claims of interest as suspect and as obscuring this unconscious dimension, I think then allows us to see the way, like, I think this politics of interest always ends up being an anti-politics, right? Like, and so I think, like, saying that every interest conceals, like, the truth of the interest is precisely the way in which it's undermining itself, right? Like, I think that's what that to me, that's like the essence of psychoanalysis, right? To show how this thing that seems to be like a pursuit of success is actually obscures a pursuit of a repeated failure, right? And so that, I think, to see the failure in every interest it would be how to try to map that out, or to try to work that out.
Thank you very much, Dimitris, and thank you very much, Todd, for your answer. And now I will give the floor to you, Yannis Kalaitsis.
Very much, Todd, for being here and for the very interesting presentation. I'm going to stay in the same line of argumentation, and I want to ask regarding that notion of shared alienation. Okay, this is the, if we can call it like that, this is the first step of a shared lack of, of a shared substance. What's the next step from that point? I mean, is it going to produce a shared identity or not? And if it is going to produce a shared identity, that identity, is it going to be a different kind of identity than the particular identities of the subjects?
No, I don't think it can produce a shared identity. I mean, I think one way to think of it is, like, is our political project to find, like, a new master signifier that would hold us all together? And I just think, no, that's not the political project. Like, instead, the political project is to say the failure is the thing that holds us together, right? Like, the alienation is the thing that holds us together. The alienation is what's universal. And so so whatever, it doesn't mean that symbolic identity goes away, but it does mean that the symbolic identity has a secondary status to its failure, or to the alienation of subjectivity. So I feel like that wouldn't create a new form of symbolic identity. It would create a situation where what's foregrounded is the failure of symbolic identity. So I don't think it would. So I don't think it. Walter Benjamin has this great line where he says, the time of the Messiah would be where everything is just as it is, except a little different. And I think that that's kind of like what I'm saying. Like, it's just like shift this little perspective to the side, and then all of a sudden, like, our investment in capitalist accumulation falls away. Like, a lot of other things shift if you shift this investment. I think that's what I would say. But I don't think it's a new symbolic identity. No.